Imagine planting a few flowers in your front yard. Just some colorful blooms to brighten things up and attract butterflies. But then your HOA Karen neighbor shows up, clipboard in hand, declaring that your garden is a violation because it doesn't meet community landscaping standards. She demanded I tear it out, file complaints, even threatened fines. So I did exactly what she asked. I transformed my little flower bed into a full-blown wildlife habitat, complete with native plants, bird feeders, and a legal designation that Karen can't do anything about. Oh, and did I mention? Now she's surrounded by even more flowers, and there's nothing she can do to stop it. Before we dive into this beautifully petty act of HOA revenge, don't forget to like, subscribe to Tailflow, and comment below if you've ever dealt with an HOA Karen like this. It all started with a few simple flower beds. I'm not talking about some elaborate botanical masterpiece, just a handful of native flowers, a couple of shrubs, and a few potted plants to add a splash of color to my front yard. I just moved into the neighborhood and thought, hey, why not make the place feel like home? Turns out, I wasn't the only one who noticed. Mr. Thompson, the elderly neighbor next door, complimented the flowers. Brings some life to the street. Kids walking by would stop to admire the butterflies. Even the mailman mentioned how nice it looked. But there was one person who didn't see it that way. Enter Karen. Karen lived across the street, the self-appointed neighborhood standards enforcer, a title she basically gave herself. She had the kind of lawn that looked like it belonged on the cover of a sterile landscaping magazine. Perfectly trimmed grass. Exactly 3 identical bushes. Zero personality. One afternoon, as I was watering my plants, I heard that sharp, unmistakable voice behind me. Excuse me. I turned around, and there she was, clipboard in hand, arms crossed, wearing a scowl like it was part of her uniform. Yes, I replied. She didn't waste time. I've noticed your front yard doesn't comply with the HOA's landscaping guidelines. I blinked. Guidelines? I'm just growing some flowers. Karen flipped through her clipboard like she was reading from the HOA Bible. Front yards must maintain a uniform appearance with approved ground cover. Your garden disrupts the aesthetic continuity of the neighborhood. I looked at my flowers, then at her expressionless lawn, then back at my flowers. I think the butterflies disagree. She didn't laugh. She just scribbled something on her clipboard and marched off. 2 days later, I found an official-looking letter taped to my door. Notice of violation. Your property is in violation of HOA landscaping regulations. Immediate removal of non-compliant plants is required. Failure to comply may result in fines. I couldn't believe it. Flowers? A violation? I checked the HOA handbook. Sure enough, there were vague rules about maintaining uniform landscaping, but nowhere did it specifically ban gardens or native plants. I could have ripped out the flowers and called it a day. But instead, I thought, you want to play petty? I can play too. That evening, as I watered my so-called violations, I had an idea. If Karen wanted to fight my little garden, fine. I'd turn it into something she couldn't touch, no matter how many complaint forms she filled out. I did some research. Turns out, you can apply to have your yard certified as a wildlife habitat through national environmental programs. All you need are 4 things. Food sources, water sources, shelter, places to raise young. I already had the flowers. Adding the rest would be easy. And here's the kicker. Once certified, it comes with legal protections, meaning even the HOA can't force you to remove it. The next weekend, I got to work. Karen, of course, was outside, pretending to sweep her perfectly clean driveway while watching me like a hawk. I planted more native flowers, added bird feeders, installed a small bird bath, even threw in a few butterfly houses for good measure. Karen couldn't resist. She stomped over, hands on hips. What are you doing now? I smiled. Improving the neighborhood aesthetic. You're welcome. Her face turned a delightful shade of red. But she didn't have a rule to quote this time. After a few weeks, once the garden was fully blooming and bustling with life, I submitted my application to the National Wildlife Federation. Photos, documentation, the whole works. A month later, I received my official certification. I wasted no time. I ordered a shiny new sign and proudly displayed it in my yard. Certified wildlife habitat, providing food, water, cover, and a place to raise young. The next morning, Karen stood on her porch, glaring at the sign like it was mocking her. She marched over with her clipboard, but stopped halfway, because she realized she couldn't do anything. It was legal, protected, and it was all her fault. After the wildlife habitat sign went up, Karen was fuming, but for once, she was also powerless. My garden was now legally protected, and her precious HOA rules couldn't touch it. But if there's one thing I'd learned about Karen, it's this. When she can't control you, she tries harder. And that's exactly what she did. A few days after I posted my certification sign, I got an email from the HOA. Subject: Special HOA meeting to address landscaping concern. Landscaping concerns? I didn't need to guess who filed the complaint. At the meeting, Karen was front and center, armed with her usual clipboard, a stack of printed photos of my garden, and an expression like she'd just bitten into a lemon. She stood up, cleared her throat dramatically, and launched into her speech. This yard violates the spirit of our community standards. It disrupts the neighborhood's aesthetic harmony and attracts excessive wildlife. Excessive wildlife? We're talking about butterflies and songbirds, not raccoons hosting house parties. When it was my turn to respond, I stayed calm. I stood up, held up my certification, and said, "My yard is a certified wildlife habitat, protected under national environmental programs. It fully complies with HOA rules and local regulations." Karen's eye twitched. She clearly wasn't expecting me to come prepared. The HOA board flipped through my documents, trying to look serious while suppressing their boredom. Finally, the HOA president sighed and said, "Well, after reviewing the materials, there's no violation here. The certification is legitimate, and we can't override federal environmental protections." Karen shot out of her seat. "So we're just going to allow this? This jungle?" Someone in the back snorted. It was Mr. Thompson, the elderly neighbor who loved my garden. He leaned over and whispered loud enough for Karen to hear, "I'd rather have a jungle than live next to a cactus." The room chuckled. Karen turned bright red. Round 2 victory. Of course, Karen wasn't done. When the HOA couldn't help her, she tried going over their heads to the city. A few weeks later, I received a notice from the city's code enforcement office. Subject: Notice of property inspection. Complaint regarding uncontrolled vegetation. Uncontrolled vegetation? Karen made it sound like I'd planted an invasive species of man-eating vines. When the city inspector showed up, I greeted him with a smile. "Let me guess, you're here about the uncontrolled vegetation?" He chuckled. "Yeah, we've had a complaint. But honestly, this looks pretty normal." I gave him the grand tour. Native flowers blooming beautifully. Butterflies dancing in the air. A bird bath with a couple of sparrows splashing around. The inspector took notes, snapped a few photos, and nodded. "Well, everything looks great. This isn't a nuisance, it's just a garden." Karen, of course, was lurking from her porch, watching the whole thing. When the inspector left without issuing any citations, she slammed her door so hard it rattled. After that, something unexpected happened. My garden started a trend. Neighbors who'd been quiet during the drama suddenly wanted to know more. Jenna down the street added a butterfly garden. Tom installed a bird bath and planted wildflowers. Even Mr. Thompson put up a birdhouse with a little sign that said, "Welcome, feathered friends." It was like Karen's campaign had accidentally created a neighborhood wildlife movement. And every time she stepped outside, she was greeted by the sight of more flowers, more birds, more life. Exactly what she tried to prevent. After her failed attempts with the HOA and the city, Karen finally gave up. No more notes. No more complaints. No more surprise HOA meetings. She started avoiding me altogether, walking the long way around the block just to avoid passing my yard. Her clipboard disappeared, and with it, her last shred of neighborhood authority. But the best part? She couldn't escape the very thing she'd fought so hard against. Because now, the whole neighborhood was in bloom. After losing the HOA battle and failing to convince the city, you'd think Karen would finally accept defeat. But this is Karen we're talking about. She wasn't just petty, she was relentlessly petty. So she pulled out one last desperate move. And this time, it blew up in her face in the most spectacular way possible. A few weeks after the city inspector cleared me, I found an anonymous petition taped to my door. Petition to maintain community landscape standard. Help restore the beauty of our neighborhood by opposing disruptive and non-traditional front yard designs. Non-traditional front yard designs? Gee, I wonder who wrote that. The language was vague, but the target was obvious. My garden. Karen didn't have the guts to put her name on it, but everyone knew exactly where it came from. Here's the thing, though. Karen made one fatal mistake. She thought the neighbors secretly agreed with her. She assumed they'd sign it just to avoid conflict. Spoiler, they didn't. Instead of signing the petition, my neighbors turned it into a joke. Jenna added a note. Needs more flowers. Tom signed it as captain of the Butterfly Protection Squad. Mr. Thompson drew a doodle of a smiling sunflower with a caption. I approve. By the time the petition made its way back to Karen's doorstep, it was covered in sarcastic signatures, doodles, and even a few ironic compliments like, Best garden ever, thanks for inspiring us. Karen's face when she saw it, priceless. But Karen wasn't done. She organized a community meeting at her house, hoping to rally support. She even made flyers. Concern about neighborhood aesthetics. Join us. Curiosity got the better of me, so I attended. Not to argue, just to watch. When I arrived, about 10 people were there. But instead of supporters, most of them were just there for the drama. Karen stood at the front with a PowerPoint presentation titled, The Dangers of Unregulated Gardening. I swear she had slides, charts, even a photo of my garden with the words, Is this what we want? Halfway through, Jenna raised her hand. Wait, are we seriously having a meeting about flowers? The room erupted in laughter. Karen's face turned the exact shade of red as one of my tulips. After the failed community meeting, Karen made one last attempt to get the HOA involved. She demanded another emergency meeting, claiming my garden was causing division in the neighborhood. When the day arrived, the room was packed. Not with Karen's supporters, but with neighbors defending my garden. Some even wore homemade t-shirts with floral designs and slogans like, Team Wildflower, bloom where you're planted. Karen stood up, did her usual dramatic rant, waving her clipboard like a gavel. But when it was my turn to speak, I simply said, I think the flowers speak for themselves. The HOA president sighed, clearly exhausted. Well, after reviewing everything, there's no violation. This matter is closed. Karen opened her mouth to protest. But the room was already applauding. Not for her. For me. After that, Karen finally gave up. No more petitions. No more meetings. No more angry notes. She still lived across the street, but she kept her blinds closed more often. Probably because every time she looked outside, she saw more flowers, more gardens, more life, and every single bloom was a reminder of her failure. Karen's final desperate attempt to regain control had completely backfired. She'd tried everything. HOA complaints, city inspections, anonymous petitions, and even a PowerPoint presentation, which still makes me laugh. But in the end, all she really accomplished was turning my little front yard garden into a community movement. Before all this drama, our neighborhood was pretty typical. Perfectly trimmed lawns, identical bushes, a sea of beige landscaping approved by the HOA. After Karen's war against my garden, it was like someone flipped a switch. People started planting everywhere. Jenna added a pollinator garden filled with wildflowers. Tom built a raised bed for vegetables, complete with trellises covered in vines. Even Mr. Thompson, who used to grumble about everything, planted sunflowers that grew taller than his fence. Karen's obsession with keeping things uniform had accidentally created the most colorful, lively, and unique street in the entire neighborhood. And she couldn't do a thing about it. Karen didn't move away, but she might as well have. She completely withdrew from community activities. No more HOA meetings. No more surprise inspection. No more passive-aggressive notes on doors. She'd walk past my garden with her head down, probably pretending it wasn't there. But I knew she saw it. She'd always see it. The flowers she tried to destroy, had become a permanent reminder of her failure. Of course, I couldn't resist one last little touch. A few months after everything settled down, I added a small plaque to my garden. It read, "Dedicated to the neighbor who inspired this garden. Thank you for helping it grow." I never mentioned her name. I didn't have to. And every time Karen walked by, she'd glance at it, then quickly look away. Victory. Looking back, this whole ordeal taught me a few valuable lessons. Petty problems deserve petty solutions. You don't always have to fight fire with fire. Sometimes you fight with flowers. Know the rules better than the people trying to enforce them. Karen counted on me not knowing my rights. But once I did, her power vanished. Community is stronger than control. Karen thought she could divide us with rules. Instead, she brought us together, with gardens of laughter and a shared love of petty victories. When life gives you a Karen, plant wildflowers. And maybe add a little plaque just for fun. Years later, the garden still thrives. The colors are just as vibrant. The butterflies still dance in the breeze. Karen? She's still there, living across the street. But instead of controlling the neighborhood, she's just another face in the background, surrounded by the very thing she tried to destroy. And every time I see a new flower bloom, I smile. Because I know Karen sees it too. And that's how a simple front yard garden turned into the ultimate symbol of HOA rebellion, and how one petty neighbor accidentally inspired an entire community to bloom. Have you ever dealt with a neighbor like Karen? Or maybe you've had your own battle with an HOA that went way too far. Share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video to support more HOA takedown tales. Subscribe to Taleflow for epic revenge stories. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next petty showdown. Thanks for watching, and remember, when life gives you a Karen, plant wildflowers. See you in the next one.